Hello there, my sleepy souls. Tonight, we journey through the complete story of Victoria, the wild-haired predator who survived for centuries through cunning and instinct before obsession consumed the survivor and revenge destroyed what nothing else could kill. I pour so much into these videos, and there are days where I question myself. But then I read one of your lovely comments and it keeps me going. I haven't reached my goal of 1,000 subscribers yet, but I'm still fighting for it. If you want to support a small creator who truly cares about what she makes, it would mean the world if you subscribed. Thank you. Now, let's begin Victoria's journey. Let her story of survival and obsession carry you gently into rest. Victoria's human life remains shrouded in mystery that even vampire memory cannot penetrate, because she shared nothing of her origins with those who knew her in immortal existence, and because the centuries between her transformation and her destruction erased whatever records might have documented her birth or her family or her circumstances before she became the predator, whose red hair and feline features would become her defining characteristics. The canon provides no name for her human self and provides no location for her birth, and provides no details about the life she lived before transformation changed her into creature whose only loyalty was to her own survival and whose only love was for the hunt she shared with James. During the decades they spent together as nomadic partners, moving through territories and leaving bodies behind them. What can be inferred from the limited information available suggests that Victoria was likely born sometime in the early 1600s, based on her apparent age at transformation, and based on the centuries of existence she accumulated before her death in the mountains of Washington in June of 2006. Her physical features suggest European ancestry, the bright red hair that characterized her appearance being relatively uncommon, but not impossible in populations from Ireland or from Scotland or from other northern regions where Celtic genetics produced the vivid coloring that would become her most memorable attribute and would become the detail that witnesses remembered when they described the wild vampire who moved like cat and who killed with efficiency that came from centuries of practice and from instincts honed through constant danger. The social context of the early 17th century in Europe was characterized by limited options for women whose lives were constrained by gender expectations and by economic realities that made survival dependent on marriage or on family protection, or on entering religious institutions that offered safety in exchange for service and obedience. Women who existed outside these traditional structures face hardship and face danger, their vulnerability to poverty and to violence creating circumstances where transformation into vampire might have seemed like rescue, even though it came with eternal thirst and with separation from humanity, and with existence as predator rather than as person. Victoria's human life probably included struggle, and probably included survival challenges that shaped her into someone whose primary skill was staying alive when others might have perished. The human foundation preparing her for immortal existence, where survival would remain her defining characteristic and her greatest ability. The transformation that created Victoria as vampire occurred sometime in the early to mid 1600s, according to timeline that can be constructed from her age at death and from references to her centuries of existence. But the specific circumstances remain unknown, because Victoria apparently never spoke of her transformation, or never revealed who created her, or never explained whether she had been transformed deliberately, or whether she had been abandoned as newborn to survive alone without guidance, or without the basic instruction that responsible vampire creators typically provided to their progeny. The violence of her transformation can be inferred from her behavior and from her instincts, and from the way she approached existence with constant wariness that suggested trauma had shaped her early experience and had taught her that trust was dangerous, and that attachment was liability, and that survival meant depending on no one except herself. Awakening as vampire brought Victoria into existence defined by enhanced physical abilities that exceeded human capacity and that made her dangerous to the species she had belonged to just days earlier, when her heart had still beaten, and when her body had still required food and sleep, and when death had still been possible through disease or through injury, or through any of the 1,000 ways that human fragility created vulnerability. Her transformation gave her strength that could crush stone and speed, that could outrun any human pursuit, and senses that could detect heartbeat from distance, and could smell blood through walls, and could hear whispered conversations from hundreds of feet away. But her most valuable asset was not the standard vampire package of enhanced abilities, but was the supernatural gift that manifested uniquely in her, and that would keep her alive through centuries when other vampires perished through carelessness, or through conflict, or through challenging opponents they should have avoided. Victoria's gift was self-preservation instinct elevated to supernatural level. The ability to sense danger and to evade threats and to escape situations that would trap or would destroy vampires who lacked her particular talent for staying alive when death seemed inevitable. Her gift operated partially on conscious level, where she could recognize threats and could plan escape routes and could evaluate situations for danger. But it also functioned instinctively in ways that moved her body and guided her decisions and pulled her away from deadly choices before her conscious mind had fully processed the risk she was avoiding. The gift made her almost impossible to catch and almost impossible to trap. Her movements unpredictable even to vampires like Alice Cullen, whose precognitive visions should have shown her future decisions, but found only shifting possibilities because Victoria's gift kept her from committing to single course of action until the last possible moment when commitment became necessary for escape or for attack. The early years as newborn vampire would have been characterized by the overwhelming thirst that defined the first year of immortal existence, and by the superior physical strength that newborns possessed during the period when human blood still lingered in their systems and still enhanced their already formidable vampire abilities. Victoria's newborn phase probably involved numerous kills, as she learned to hunt and learned to feed and learned to manage the burning thirst that demanded constant attention and constant satisfaction through human blood. That was the natural diet for her species, regardless of what rare vampires like the Cullens would later demonstrate was technically possible through animal blood alternative. her survival instinct would have guided her away from populated areas where numerous kills would attract attention and would bring human mobs with fire and with weapons. The historical record of vampire purges and vampire hunts throughout European history, demonstrating that humans could be dangerous to vampires when they organized, and when they brought sufficient numbers, and when they trapped vampires in situations where escape was impossible and where burning was inevitable. Learning to hunt involved developing techniques for approaching prey without alerting them to danger, and for killing efficiently without creating spectacle that would be remembered and would be discussed, and would create patterns that observant humans might notice and might investigate. Victoria's hunting style developed into careful predation that prioritized her safety over the thrill of the chase. Her kills selected for convenience and for minimal risk, rather than for sport or for challenge. She learned to dispose of bodies in ways that prevented discovery, or that made deaths appear natural, or that obscured the evidence of vampire involvement, the survival instinct that was her gift, teaching her that drawing attention was dangerous, and that invisibility was safety, and that the best hunt was the one that no one ever knew had occurred. Her nomadic pattern established itself early in her vampire existence. The recognition that staying in any location too long created risk of exposure when unchanging appearance would eventually be noticed by humans whose memories spanned years, and whose suspicions would be aroused by a woman who never aged and who was never seen in daylight, and whose presence coincided with mysterious deaths or disappearances. Moving constantly meant maintaining anonymity, and meant avoiding the relationships that would create expectations and would create questions and would eventually require explanations that would threaten the masquerade that protected vampires from organized human response. Victoria's survival instinct made her embrace isolation as strategy, the loneliness of nomadic existence being acceptable price for the safety that came from having no ties and no history and no one who could betray her location or could reveal her nature to authorities who might organize hunt. Vici, centuries before she met James, passed in pattern of movement and feeding and survival that characterized nomadic vampire existence throughout the periods when vampire civilization was less organized, and when vampire law was less established, and when individual vampires or small covens moved through territories claiming temporary hunting grounds before moving on to avoid detection or to avoid conflict with other vampires whose territorial claims might create confrontation. Victoria survived the vampire wars that periodically erupted in various regions when vampires competed for territory or for resources or for power. Her gift, allowing her to sense approaching danger and to flee before she became caught in conflicts that would destroy less cautious vampires who stayed to fight when they should have run. She witnessed the formation and dissolution of covens, and witnessed the rise and fall of vampire leaders who claimed authority over regions before being destroyed by rivals or being eliminated by the Volturi who enforced vampire law, and who eliminated threats to the secrecy that protected vampire civilization from human awareness and human response. Europe during the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries was dangerous territory for vampires. The periodic purges and the organized hunts and the religious fervor that identified vampires as demons requiring destruction, creating an environment where survival meant constant vigilance and constant movement. Victoria's gift kept her alive when other vampires were caught and were burned, her instinct pulling her away from areas where human organization was becoming dangerous and pulling her toward territories where vampire presence was less known, and where kills could be attributed to wolves or to disease or to human violence, rather than being recognized as evidence of supernatural predation. The witch trials and the vampire hunts and the various panics that swept through European populations during these centuries created climate of fear that was dangerous for vampires, even though it was ostensibly directed at humans who were accused of supernatural crimes they had not committed. The eventual migration to North America probably occurred sometime in the 18th or 19th century, when European territories became increasingly difficult for vampires, and when the New World offered vast territories with smaller human populations and with less organized authority that could threaten vampire existence. The journey across ocean would have required careful planning to avoid sunlight exposure during daylight hours, and to avoid suspicion from ship crews who might notice passenger who never ate and never appeared on deck during sunny weather, and whose presence might coincide with disappearances if Victoria had needed to feed during the crossing. North America offered advantages for nomadic vampires like Victoria, who preferred isolation and preferred territories where they could hunt without constant risk of exposure. The frontier regions and the wilderness areas providing cover and providing hunting grounds where human deaths could be attributed to accidents or to wildlife, or to the various dangers that characterize life in regions where civilization was thin and where law enforcement was minimal or was non-existent. Victoria's physical appearance in vampire form combined her human features with the enhancement that transformation created in all vampires whose beauty became supernatural and whose appearance became designed to attract human prey through visual appeal that overcame human caution and human self-preservation instincts. Her red hair remained her most distinctive feature, but became more vivid and more striking in ways that human hair could never achieve. The color catching light and drawing attention in ways that made her memorable and made her recognizable in a world where many vampires look similar, through the marble skin and the perfect features and the beauty that characterized vampire appearance generally. Her face was angular and was feline, the pointed chin and the high cheekbones and the cat-like eyes creating appearance that suggested predator, even when she was attempting to appear harmless or appear human. During the brief interactions she had with human populations, when necessity required her to move through towns, or to purchase items, or to maintain minimal contact with the mortal world. Her grace was particularly cat-like in ways that exceeded normal vampire grace that was already superior to human movement. Her body moving with fluid economy that suggested wild animal rather than suggesting human woman, whose movements were constrained by social training and by gender expectations about appropriate feminine behavior. She could be absolutely still in ways that humans found unsettling when they noticed her. The predator's patience allowing her to wait without movement and without apparent breathing until the moment for action arrived, and speed replaced stillness in instant transition that human observers could not track and could not process before she had disappeared from their sight and from their awareness. Her speed was exceptional, even among vampires whose supernatural velocity already exceeded human perception. Her gift enhancing her natural abilities and allowing her to move in ways that made her almost impossible to follow and almost impossible to catch. When she chose to flee rather than choosing to fight. Her tracking abilities were adequate, but were not exceptional. Her skill in following prey being sufficient for successful hunting, but not being remarkable in world, where some vampires possessed tracking as supernatural gift that exceeded normal vampire abilities in ways that made them legendary hunters whose prey never escaped once the hunt had begun. Victoria could follow scent trails and could track movement patterns and could anticipate where prey might go based on behavior and on terrain, but she lacked the instinctive certainty and the supernatural precision that characterize gifted trackers whose abilities bordered on precognition in their accuracy and in their reliability. Her survival gift compensated for her ordinary tracking ability by keeping her alive when hunts went wrong, or when prey proved dangerous, or when situations developed complications that less cautious vampires might not notice until too late to escape. The centuries of solitary existence before meeting James created Victoria, whose personality was shaped by isolation and by constant vigilance and by the survival instinct that made her trust no one and attach to nothing, and remain always ready to flee when danger approached. She had no friends and had no companions and had no allegiances beyond her own continued existence. The loneliness being acceptable price for safety, and the isolation being preferable to vulnerability that came from depending on others whose interests might not align with hers, and whose presence might create liability rather than creating advantage. She was wild in ways that civilized vampires found disturbing. Her behavior and her instincts and her appearance all suggesting creature who had never been properly socialized into vampire civilization and who operated according to rules that prioritize survival over social niceties and over the elaborate pretense that some vampires maintained about being more than predators. Human life and transformation had created Victoria, but centuries of survival had refined her into the vampire she would be when James finally appeared and finally offered partnership that would change her existence and would give her something beyond mere survival to occupy her immortal years. The meeting between Victoria and James occurred sometime in the early 20th century, according to the timeline that can be constructed from their established partnership. By the time they encountered the Cullens in 2005, and from references suggesting they had been together for decades before that fatal confrontation in Forks changed everything and set Victoria on the path toward obsession and toward destruction. The exact date and the exact location of their first encounter remain unknown, because neither Victoria nor James apparently shared the story with others, and because their relationship was characterized by action rather than by words and by hunting, rather than by the romantic narratives that some vampire couples constructed about their origins and their bond. What can be inferred suggests that their meeting was probably competitive rather than romantic. Two predators encountering each other in territory that one or both of them claimed, and assessing whether the other represented threat requiring elimination or represented potential ally whose abilities might complement their own. James possessed the gift of tracking that made him legendary among vampires who knew his reputation and who understood that his prey never escaped once he had committed to the hunt, and once he had caught their scent and decided they were worth pursuing. His ability exceeded normal vampire tracking that relied on following scent trails and on observing physical evidence of passage. His gift operating on instinctive level that allowed him to know where his prey would go and to anticipate their movements, and to find them regardless of how they attempted to hide or to obscure their trail. The tracking was supernatural in ways that made it nearly infallible, his success rate approaching perfection across the decades he had spent hunting both human prey and vampire prey, when circumstances or boredom or challenge made him choose to hunt his own kind rather than limiting himself to the humans whose blood sustained vampire existence, but whose pursuit offered little intellectual stimulation to Hunter, whose abilities made normal hunting almost trivially easy. The recognition between Victoria and James when they first encountered each other was mutual acknowledgement of what they both were beneath, whatever pretense other vampires might maintain about being civilized or being more than predators, whose existence revolved around killing and feeding and surviving. They were both nomadic vampires who moved through territories without establishing permanent residence and without forming the kind of stable covens that characterize vampires like the Cullens or like the Denali, or like the various other groups who maintained consistent membership and maintained established territories where they enforced their claim and where they excluded intruders. They were both dangerous in ways that went beyond normal vampire capacity for violence, their individual gifts making them formidable opponents and making them valuable potential allies if alliance could be formed without creating the vulnerability that came from trusting another predator whose interests might eventually diverge and whose loyalty might prove temporary when circumstances changed. Victoria's decision to remain with James, rather than to continue her solitary existence, represented significant shift in her behavior and in her strategy for survival. The choice to form partnership requiring her to override the instincts that had kept her alone for centuries and that had protected her through isolation and through refusing attachments that might create liability. Her gift did not warn her away from James despite the danger that any partnership represented. The survival instinct apparently calculating that his tracking ability, combined with her evasion ability, created complementary skill set that made them more effective together than either would be separately. The partnership offered advantages that solitary existence could not provide. His ability to find prey combining with her ability to sense danger, creating hunting team whose efficiency exceeded what individual vampire could achieve and whose combined gifts made them nearly unstoppable when they chose target and committed to pursuit. The relationship between Victoria and James was not romantic in the way that humans understood romance, or in the way that some vampire couples like Carlyle and Esme, or like later Edward and Bella, would demonstrate through their devotion and through their emotional intimacy and through their expressed affection that went beyond partnership and into territory of genuine love, as humans might recognize it. Victoria and James were partners in hunting first and foremost, their bond created through shared kills and through shared pursuit and through the satisfaction that came from successful hunts where they worked together and where their combined abilities made them more effective and made the hunt more interesting than either could achieve alone. Their relationship was characterized by mutual respect between predators who recognized each other's abilities and who valued each other's contributions to their shared success. The partnership being pragmatic arrangement that benefited both parties, rather than being emotional connection that transcended practicality. But Victoria loved James in the way that predators could love, her attachment to him being real even if it was different from human love, And even if it was focused on what they did together, rather than on emotional intimacy, or on the kind of vulnerability that human relationships often required. She admired his tracking gift, and admired his commitment to the hunt, and admired his skill in choosing prey and in pursuing them with patience and with creativity that made each kill interesting, rather than making hunting become routine task that lost meaning through repetition. He represented the first being she had trusted in centuries of solitary existence, his presence in her life being anchor and being partnership, and being the relationship that made her immortal existence feel less empty and less focused exclusively on mere survival. The trust she developed was significant for a vampire who had survived by trusting no one. Her willingness to hunt with him and to coordinate with him, and to rely on his abilities, representing fundamental change in how she approached existence and how she understood her own nature. James valued Victoria for her survival instinct that kept them safe when his focus on prey might have made him careless about other dangers, and for her speed that allowed her to pursue prey he had identified and to execute kills efficiently once he had tracked target to their location. He led the partnership because his tracking gift was more directly applicable to hunting than her evasion gift was, his ability to find prey being the skill that initiated each hunt, while her ability to avoid danger was defensive capacity that kept them alive, but did not directly contribute to finding and killing targets. But his leadership did not mean he dismissed her input or ignored her warnings when her instinct identified threats. His recognition that her gift had kept her alive for centuries, creating respect for her judgment about danger, even when he was confident in his own abilities, and even when he wanted to pursue course of action that her instinct suggested was risky. Laurent joined their partnership some time after Victoria and James had established their dynamic. The third vampire apparently seeking the security that came from belonging to coven, even if that coven was small and was nomadic, and was focused on hunting rather than on the kind of civilized existence that some vampires cultivated through established residences and through integration with human society. Laurent was less invested in hunting as primary purpose and was more interested in convenience and in safety, his personality being more cautious and more calculating than James's commitment to pursuit or Victoria's instinctive wariness. He contributed to the group through his willingness to participate in hunts and through providing additional numbers that made their small coven slightly more formidable when encountering other vampires whose territorial claims might create conflict. But he was never as committed to the hunting lifestyle as James and Victoria were, and was never as comfortable with the nomadic existence that characterized their movement through territories. The dynamic among the three vampires placed James as clear leader, whose decisions about where to hunt and who to pursue were generally accepted by Victoria and Laurent, even when they had reservations or concerns about particular choices. Victoria occupied position as James's primary partner, and as the vampire whose opinion carried weight when decisions were being made, her relationship with James giving her influence that Laurent lacked, and that Laurent apparently accepted without resentment or without challenging the established hierarchy. Laurent was follower who benefited from the partnership, but who contributed less to the actual hunting than Victoria did, and who was less essential to the coven's function than either James or Victoria was, his presence being convenient but not being necessary in ways that would make his eventual departure create significant disruption to the remaining partnership between the two primary members. Their hunting together created intimacy that went beyond simple cooperation, and that created bond through shared experience of pursuit and kill and feeding. The satisfaction of successful hunt being something they experienced together and something that connected them in ways that centuries of solitary hunting had never provided to Victoria during her long existence before James. The thrill of tracking prey and of anticipating their movements and of closing in for the kill and of tasting blood while it was still warm from living body created shared pleasure that was physical and was psychological and was the foundation of whatever love existed between them. They hunted across North America during the decades of their partnership, moving through territories and selecting prey and killing efficiently before moving on to new locations where their previous kills would not be connected and would not create patterns that might alert authorities or might alert other vampires whose territories they were traversing. Their reputation among other vampires who encountered them or who heard about them was that they were dangerous and were efficient and were not to be challenged unless absolutely necessary for territorial defense or for protection of claimed humans or for other compelling reasons that justified potential conflict with skilled hunters whose combined abilities made them formidable opponents. Most vampires avoided confrontation with James and Victoria when possible. The recognition that James's tracking meant he could find anyone who fled, and that Victoria's evasion meant she could escape most attacks, creating understanding that fighting them would be costly even for vampires who might ultimately prevail through superior numbers or through superior gifts. The nomadic lifestyle meant they rarely stayed long enough in any territory to create serious conflicts with established covens, their pattern being to hunt briefly in area and then to move on before their presence became problem requiring response from vampires who claimed the region as their established hunting ground. The decades together created established patterns in their relationship and in their hunting that made their partnership feel permanent and feel stable in ways that Victoria's previous solitary existence had never felt. The continuity of having James as constant companion and as reliable partner, creating security that she had not experienced since her transformation, had made her vampire and had made her dependent on her own abilities for survival. She deferred to him in decisions about hunting, but maintained her independence in ways that made clear she was partner rather than being subordinate. Her willingness to follow his lead coming from respect for his tracking ability, rather than coming from submission or from weakness. The partnership was balanced through their complementary gifts and through their mutual recognition that they were more effective together than separately, the arrangement benefiting both of them in ways that made continued association worth whatever risks came from trusting another vampire and from forming attachment that created vulnerability. Victoria's role within the partnership was to evaluate situations for danger and to plan escape routes and to assess threats that James's focus on prey might cause him to overlook when his attention was consumed by the hunt and by the tracking that directed his movements and his decisions. Her gift operated constantly even when they were not actively hunting. The survival instinct monitoring their environment and monitoring other vampires and monitoring human authorities and monitoring anything that might represent threat to their continued existence. She identified safe hunting grounds and identified dangerous territories and identified situations where they should avoid confrontation or should flee, rather than fighting when fighting would create unnecessary risk. Her strategic thinking complemented James's tactical brilliance in tracking and in pursuit, the combination of their abilities creating a hunting team whose success rate was exceptional and whose survival across decades in nomadic existence demonstrated the effectiveness of their partnership. The hunting style they developed together involved James identifying prey through his tracking sense that could detect interesting targets from distance, or could follow trails that normal vampires would lose, and then both of them pursuing the prey with coordination that came from years of practice and from understanding each other's abilities and limitations. Victoria's speed allowed her to cut off escape routes or to drive prey toward James when he was positioned for the kill. Her movement and his tracking creating pincer pattern that made escape nearly impossible for targets who were caught between two vampires whose gifts made them nearly perfect hunters. They killed efficiently and killed without excess cruelty, their interest being in the hunt and in the blood, rather than being in causing suffering or in creating spectacle that some vampires apparently enjoyed when they treated hunting as entertainment rather than treating it as necessity or as purpose. The shared kills created moments of intimacy where Victoria felt closest to James, the cooperation and the success, and the feeding together being experiences that connected them, and that made her feel that the partnership was worthwhile and was meaningful beyond simple survival advantages. She valued those moments and valued the satisfaction of a successful hunt, and valued James's presence beside her when they fed, and when they moved on to new territory, and when they existed together in the nomadic pattern that characterized their decades of partnership. The relationship gave her existence purpose beyond mere survival, the hunting together being activity that was engaging and was satisfying in ways that solitary hunting had never been, even when solitary hunting had been successful and had been sufficient for keeping her alive. The years from their meeting in early 20th century through their arrival in Forks territory in March of 2005 represented a period of stability and of established pattern in Victoria's existence, the partnership with James being constant, even as Laurent joined and as they moved through territories and as decades passed without fundamental change in their dynamic or in their purpose. She had found partner and had found purpose and had found existence that felt complete in ways that her previous centuries of solitude had not felt. The hunting partnership with James being a relationship that satisfied her predator nature, and that made her immortal existence feel meaningful rather than feeling like endless repetition of survival without purpose or without connection to anything beyond her own continued existence. The arrival in Forks territory during March of 2005 was unremarkable initially. The small logging town on Washington's Olympic Peninsula, being one of many locations that Victoria and James and Laurent passed through during their nomadic movement across the Pacific Northwest region, where persistent cloud cover and frequent rainfall created conditions favorable for vampire movement during daylight hours without excessive risk of exposure through sparkling skin that sunlight would reveal. The Olympic Peninsula offered dense forests for hunting and offered small human populations scattered through rural areas where disappearances could be attributed to accidents or to wildlife attack, or to the various dangers that characterize life in regions where wilderness dominated and where human civilization existed in small pockets, surrounded by vast stretches of territory, where predators, both natural and supernatural, could operate without immediate detection. Their intention was probably to hunt briefly in the area, and to move on following their established pattern of never remaining long enough in any single location to create memorable presence, or to establish patterns that might alert authorities, or might alert other vampires whose territories they were crossing. The encounter with the Cullen scent changed everything and transformed routine hunting trip into the sequence of events that would lead to James's death, and would lead to Victoria's obsession, and would ultimately lead to her own destruction in the mountains north of Forks, 15 months after that initial meeting. Laurent recognized the scent as belonging to vampires he had encountered previously during his time with the Denali Coven in Alaska. His knowledge of the Cullens being limited, but being sufficient to identify them as the unusual vegetarian coven who subsisted on animal blood rather than on human blood, and who maintained permanent residence rather than moving nomadically, and who integrated themselves into human society through Carlisle Cullen's medical career and through the younger vampires' repeated enrollment in human schools. The information intrigued James, whose interest in unusual vampires and unusual situations made him curious about encountering the vegetarian coven, and about observing how they lived, and about potentially challenging their claims to territory, if such challenge would provide interesting hunt or would create memorable confrontation. Victoria's instinct warned her that investigating the Cullens represented unnecessary risk. Her gift for survival identifying potential danger in approaching established coven on their own territory, where they would have advantages of numbers and of familiarity with terrain and of defensive position if confrontation developed. She expressed her concerns to James, but did not push strongly against his decision to investigate, because their partnership dynamic meant that he made final decisions about where they went and what they did, and she followed his lead, even when her instinct suggested caution would be a wiser course of action. Laurent was characteristically neutral about the decision, his typical pattern being to avoid expressing strong opinions and to go along with whatever James decided while maintaining enough distance to preserve his own safety if situations became dangerous. His commitment to the group being contingent and being based on convenience, rather than being based on loyalty or on genuine investment in their collective success or collective survival. The baseball game happening in the clearing during the thunderstorm on an evening in mid-March of 2005 provided the circumstance that brought the two covens into direct contact, the Cullens taking advantage of the thunder to mask the sound of bat hitting ball with force that would have been impossible for humans, and that would have created noise that would have carried for miles without the natural cover that the storm provided. James and Victoria and Laurent approached during the game, their presence undetected initially because the Cullens were focused on their activity, and because the thunder and the concentration required for the sport they were playing made them less alert to their surroundings than they would normally have been when on their own territory. The three nomadic vampires emerged from the forest at the edge of the clearing, their appearance interrupting the game and creating immediate tension as the two groups faced each other and assessed whether this encounter would remain peaceful or would develop into conflict that could result in violence and could result in destruction of vampires from one side or the other. The confrontation in the clearing followed, patterns that characterize vampire territorial encounters, the initial exchange being cautious and being formal, as Carlisle Cullen stepped forward to represent his coven and to attempt diplomatic resolution that would allow the nomadic vampires to pass through the territory without conflict. James responded with apparent courtesy that masked his predatory nature and masked his immediate assessment of the Cullen's strengths and weaknesses, his tracker's instinct already evaluating them and already noting their positions and already cataloguing information that might become relevant if circumstances shifted from peaceful encounter to violent confrontation. Victoria remained alert and remained ready to flee if the situation became dangerous. Her gift, monitoring the Cullens and monitoring the dynamics, and monitoring everything that might indicate she needed to escape before violence began, and before she became trapped in fight she had not chosen and had not wanted. The wind shifting carried Isabella Swan's scent across the clearing in moment that transformed peaceful encounter into the beginning of the hunt that would consume James and would eventually destroy him. The human scent being unexpected and being impossible, because vampires did not bring humans to vampire gatherings and did not expose humans to vampire presence, except as prey designated for killing. The scent reached James and reached all the vampires present simultaneously, the smell of human blood and human warmth creating immediate reaction that varied based on each vampire's control and each vampire's feeding habits and each vampire's relationship to the human, whose scent had just revealed her presence among the vampires who should have been alone in the clearing. James's reaction was instantaneous and was unmistakable, his body shifting into hunting crouch and his eyes focusing on the source of the scent, and his entire demeanor changing from cautious courtesy to predatory focus that indicated his tracker's instinct had just identified prey that interested him and that he was already committed to pursuing. Edward Cullen's protective response was equally immediate and equally revealing. His movement to shield Bella and his defensive posture, and his obvious claim on her as protected human rather than as available prey, making clear that this was not random human who had wandered into vampire territory, but was human who belonged to the Cullens and who was under their protection. The confrontation shifted in that instant from territorial dispute between vampire covens to challenge between tracker and protector. James, recognizing that Edward was claiming the human as his, and Edward recognizing that James had just designated Bella as target for hunt, that would not end until James had killed her or until James himself had been destroyed. The game had begun in that moment of scent and of claim and of challenge. The predator in James, responding to the obstacle that Edward represented and to the difficulty that hunting protected prey would create, and to the thrill that came from pursuing target that would require skill and would require patience and would provide satisfaction beyond what normal hunting could provide. Victoria understood immediately that the situation had become dangerous and had become potentially catastrophic for their small group. Her survival instinct screaming warnings about confronting 7 vampires on their own territory over human, who was clearly important enough to them that they would fight to protect her. She wanted to leave and wanted to convince James to abandon the hunt and wanted to preserve their partnership by removing them from situation that her gift identified as threatening to their continued existence. But she knew that James had already committed to the hunt in the moment when he had caught Bella's scent and had recognized her as protected prey, representing irresistible challenge. Her loyalty to James and her partnership with him meant that she would follow him into the danger that her instinct warned against. The conflict between her survival gift and her attachment to her mate, creating tension that would characterize the days that followed as James pursued Bella. And as the Cullens mobilized to protect her, and as Victoria found herself supporting Hunt, that her instincts told her was a mistake and was dangerous and would lead to destruction. The Cullens' response to James's obvious interest in Bella was immediate mobilization to protect her. Carlyle's diplomatic approach abandoned in favor of defensive positioning that made clear they would fight to prevent James from reaching the human girl who had somehow become part of their family and who had somehow become important enough that they were willing to risk conflict with nomadic vampires whose reputation and whose abilities made them dangerous opponents. Edward's ability to read minds gave him access to James's thoughts and gave him understanding of James's commitment to the hunt, and gave him knowledge that this was not casual interest that could be deflected through negotiation or through offering alternative prey, but was Tracker's fixation on challenge that represented the kind of hunt that James lived for, and that James would not abandon regardless of obstacles or regardless of danger to himself. The confrontation ended without immediate violence, but ended with clear understanding that the hunt had begun and that James would pursue Bella, and that the Cullens would defend her, and that resolution would come through either James's success in killing Bella or through James's destruction at the hands of the Cullens who were protecting her. The three nomadic vampires withdrew from the clearing, their departure being tactical retreat rather than being abandonment of the hunt. James already planning his approach and already using his tracking gift to follow Bella's scent and to learn her patterns and to identify opportunities for separating her from her protectors. Victoria followed James because partnership meant supporting his decisions, even when those decisions conflicted with her survival instinct. Her love for him and her loyalty to him, overriding the warnings that her gift was providing about the danger they were entering and about the likelihood that this hunt would end badly for them. Laurent's response to the situation was characteristically self-preserving. His assessment of the danger leading him to separate from James and Victoria and to seek safety with the Denali Coven in Alaska, where his previous acquaintance with them would allow him to claim sanctuary and would allow him to distance himself from the hunt that James was pursuing and from the confrontation with the Cullens that Laurent wanted no part of. His departure represented acknowledgement that his loyalty to the group was limited and was contingent on his own safety. His willingness to abandon James and Victoria when circumstances became dangerous, revealing that he had always been peripheral member, whose commitment was never as deep as the bond between the two primary partners. Victoria felt no particular resentment about Laurent's defection. Her recognition that he was weak link and was never truly committed to their partnership, making his departure expected and making it irrelevant to her continued support of James in the hunt he had committed to. The chase that followed the clearing confrontation involved James and Victoria working together to separate Bella from the Cullens and to create opportunity for James to reach her and to kill her. Their coordination being tested against the Cullens' defensive strategy and against Alice Cullen's precognitive visions that allowed her to see James's decisions before he acted on them. Victoria's role was to provide distraction and to lead some of the Cullens away from Bella, while James approached from a different direction, her superior evasion abilities making her ideal for drawing, pursuit that she could then escape while James used the diversion to get closer to his target. She led Alice Cullen and Jasper Hale on pursuit through Washington Territory, her speed and her instinct allowing her to stay ahead of them, despite Alice's ability to see her decisions and despite Jasper's combat experience and tracking abilities that made him formidable pursuer. The techniques Victoria used to evade Alice and Jasper included crossing water to break scent trails and included changing direction unpredictably, and included using her gift to avoid committing to single course of action until the last possible moment when commitment became necessary for movement. The indecision making Alice's visions less reliable because Victoria's future remained uncertain until she actually made choices that determined where she would go. She led them away from Forks and away from wherever James was pursuing Bella, her effectiveness as distraction being measured by how long she could keep the Cullens occupied and how far she could lead them from the actual hunt that James was conducting. The pursuit continued for hours and possibly for days as Victoria moved through territories and crossed boundaries and used every technique she had developed across centuries of survival to maintain distance and to avoid being caught by vampires whose abilities and whose determination made them dangerous pursuers. James's plan to lure Bella to Phoenix by manipulating her into believing her mother was in danger represented the kind of psychological strategy that characterized his more complex hunts. His understanding of human psychology and human emotional vulnerabilities, allowing him to exploit Bella's protective instincts and to separate her from the Cullens who were guarding her. Victoria was not directly involved in the Phoenix trap because her role was to continue distracting the Cullens and to keep them pursuing her, while James executed his plan in Arizona, where Bella had gone, believing she could save her mother from danger that James had fabricated through his manipulation and through his understanding of what would make Bella abandon her protectors and make herself vulnerable. The separation of Victoria from James during this crucial phase meant that she was not present when James confronted Bella in the ballet studio, and was not present when Edward and the other Cullens arrived to save Bella and to destroy James. The death of James happened in late March of 2005 in the ballet studio in Phoenix, where he had lured Bella and where he had begun torturing her and had begun the process of killing her when Edward and Emmett and Alice and Jasper arrived to intervene and to prevent the completion of the hunt that James had been pursuing. Victoria was hundreds of miles away leading her own pursuit when she felt something change, her connection to James being strong enough that his destruction registered somehow in her awareness, even though she had no supernatural bond that would transmit his death across distance, and even though vampire mates did not share the kind of psychic connection that would make his ending immediately apparent to her. The knowledge that he was gone came through absence rather than through presence. The sudden emptiness where partnership had been creating certainty that James no longer existed, and that the Cullens had killed him, and that her mate was destroyed and was gone forever. Her choice in that moment was between attempting revenge immediately and surviving to pursue revenge later. Her gift for self-preservation making clear that approaching the Cullens while they were alert and were mobilized would be suicide and would accomplish nothing except adding her destruction to James's destruction. She chose survival in that instant, her nature and her gift, and her centuries of prioritizing staying alive overriding the immediate rage and the immediate grief and the immediate desire to attack the vampires who had killed her mate. She fled while the Cullens were occupied with Bella and with destroying James's body and with dealing with the aftermath of the confrontation, her escape being facilitated by her evasion abilities and by the Cullens' focus on their own concerns rather than on pursuing the second nomadic vampire whose threat they had apparently decided was minimal compared to James's direct danger to Bella. The weeks following James's death in late March of 2005 transformed Victoria from nomadic hunter, whose existence had been defined by partnership and by the shared pursuit of prey, into solitary predator, whose every thought and whose every action became focused on single purpose that consumed her completely and that would ultimately lead to her own destruction. The grief she experienced was not human grief, characterized by tears and by emotional processing and by gradual healing that time provided to mortal beings whose losses eventually faded into memory and into acceptance, but was vampire grief that remained sharp and remained permanent and remained unchanging across the months that followed, because vampire emotions did not soften and did not fade and did not transform into anything except the crystallized pain that would persist for as long as she existed. The emptiness of hunting alone after decades of partnership created constant awareness of James's absence, every kill reminding her that he was not there to share it, and every successful hunt feeling hollow, because the satisfaction had always come from the shared experience rather than from the feeding itself. The rage that built alongside the grief was cleaner and was more useful than the mourning, the anger providing direction and providing purpose and providing focus that transformed her from grieving mate into calculating avenger, whose survival instincts were now directed toward planning revenge rather than toward avoiding danger. The target of her rage was Isabella Swan, the human girl whose existence had attracted James's attention and whose protection had motivated the Cullens to destroy him, and whose survival represented the reason that Victoria's mate was dead, and that Victoria's partnership was ended, and that Victoria's existence had been reduced to solitary hunting that felt meaningless without James to share it. The logic of blaming Bella was emotionally satisfying, even if it was not rationally sound. The human being easier target for Victoria's rage than the Cullens, whose superior numbers and whose defensive success made them more difficult to hate, without acknowledging her own limitations and her own inability to have prevented James's death through her presence or through her intervention. The decision to pursue revenge rather than to move on and to find new purpose or new partnership represented choice that Victoria's survival instinct should have warned against, but that her grief and her rage apparently overrode through intensity that made vengeance seem more important than continued existence. She could have left the area and could have resumed nomadic hunting and could have eventually found another vampire to partner with, or could have returned to solitary existence that had sustained her for centuries before James. But the option of moving forward without revenge felt like betrayal of James's memory, and felt like acceptance of his death, and felt like admitting that the Cullens had won, and that their protection of Bella had been successful, and that Victoria was powerless to respond. The pride and the rage and the grief combined to make revenge seem necessary and seem inevitable and seem like the only acceptable response to the loss she had suffered and to the destruction of the partnership that had defined her existence for decades. Understanding the Cullens became Victoria's primary occupation during the months following James's death. Her observation from distance and her careful research teaching her about their patterns and about their strengths and about their weaknesses that might be exploited if she could identify vulnerability and could create strategy that would allow her to reach Bella despite the protection that the vegetarian coven provided. She learned that Edward Cullen could read minds and could hear thoughts of anyone near him except for Bella, whose mind was apparently shielded through some supernatural protection that made her immune to his gift. The mind-reading ability making direct approach dangerous because Edward would know her intentions before she acted on them and would alert the other Cullens to her presence and to her plans. She learned that Alice Cullen possessed precognitive visions that showed her the future based on decisions that people made. The visions allowing Alice to see attacks before they happened and to position defenses before Victoria could execute plans that Alice's gift would reveal in advance. Jasper Hale's military background and combat experience made him dangerous in ways that went beyond his physical abilities, his expertise in strategy and in tactics making him effective defender who would coordinate the Cullens' response to any attack Victoria attempted. Emmett Cullen's superior strength made him formidable opponent in direct combat, his physical power exceeding even normal vampire strength, and making him capable of destroying Victoria if he managed to catch her, despite her evasion abilities. Rosalie Hale's protective instincts regarding her family and her particular devotion to protecting those the Cullens claimed made her motivated defender whose commitment to Bella's safety would make her dangerous opponent, despite her lack of specialized combat gifts. Carlisle Cullen's age and experience and diplomatic skills made him an effective leader, whose centuries of existence had taught him strategy and had taught him how to manage conflicts and how to protect those under his care. Esme Cullen's maternal nature and her devotion to her family made her willing to fight despite her gentle personality. Her motivation to protect her adopted children, including Edward, and by extension protecting Edward's human mate, making her committed defender who would participate in Bella's protection regardless of personal risk. The first attempts to reach Bella during the spring and summer of 2005 involved testing the Cullen defenses without fully committing to attack that would expose Victoria to destruction if the attempt failed, her strategy being to probe for weaknesses and to learn their response patterns and to identify opportunities that might allow her to separate Bella from her protectors long enough to kill her. She left her scent on Cullen territory deliberately to create psychological pressure and to remind them that she had not forgotten and that she remained threat to Bella's safety. The scent marking being warning and being promised that she would eventually find way to reach the human girl, regardless of how carefully the Cullens protected her. The Cullens responded by maintaining constant guard rotation around Bella, their vigilance making it nearly impossible for Victoria to approach without being detected and without facing multiple defenders whose combined abilities would make escape difficult even for vampire whose gift was evasion and survival. Victoria's patience during these months of failed attempts demonstrated discipline that her grief and rage might have prevented if she had been less intelligent or less controlled. Her willingness to wait for perfect opportunity rather than attacking recklessly, showing that her survival instinct remained functional despite her obsession and despite her desire for immediate revenge. Each failed approach taught her something about Cullen defenses and about their coordination and about their commitment to protecting Bella. The accumulated knowledge building toward understanding that might eventually reveal vulnerability she could exploit. She watched Bella from distance when opportunities presented themselves, her observations teaching her about the human girl's routines and about her relationships and about her vulnerabilities that might be leveraged if Victoria could create situation where those vulnerabilities became exploitable. The problem of Alice Cullen's precognitive visions became central challenge that Victoria needed to solve if she was going to succeed in reaching Bella. The realization that Alice could see her decisions before Victoria acted on them, making traditional planning impossible because any firm decision would appear in Alice's visions and would allow the Cullens to position defenses before Victoria could execute her attack. Victoria experimented with her decision-making process and discovered that Alice's visions were based on committed decisions rather than on possibilities or on options that remained undecided. The limitation meaning that Victoria could avoid Alice's sight by refusing to commit to specific plan until the last possible moment when commitment became necessary for action. The mental discipline required to maintain indecision while still moving toward goal was difficult, but was achievable for vampire whose survival had depended on adaptability and on responding to situations as they developed, rather than following predetermined plans that might become obsolete when circumstances changed. The technique of staying indecisive created uncertainty in Alice's visions that made Victoria's future appear as multiple possibilities rather than as single determined course of action. The proliferation of potential futures apparently overwhelming Alice's ability to determine which path Victoria would actually choose, and making it difficult for the Cullens to prepare adequate defenses when they could not predict with certainty where Victoria would appear, or when she would attack, or what method she would use to attempt reaching Bella. Victoria practiced the mental flexibility required to hold multiple plans simultaneously and to avoid committing to any single approach until circumstances forced decision. Her gift for survival adapting to incorporate the anti-precognition strategy and to use indecision as weapon against Alice's visions in ways that played to Victoria's strengths and that compensated for her lack of offensive abilities that would allow her to fight the Cullens directly. Edward Cullen's departure from Forks in September of 2005 represented unexpected development that Victoria learned about through her continued surveillance of the area. The Cullens apparently leaving and apparently abandoning Bella without the protection that they had maintained so carefully during the months following James's death. The opportunity seemed almost too convenient, and Victoria's survival instinct warned that the abandonment might be trap designed to lure her into attacking when Cullens were actually still monitoring Bella and were waiting for Victoria to reveal herself through attempted assault on unprotected human. She approached cautiously and confirmed that the Cullens had indeed left Forks and had indeed left Bella apparently unguarded. But her attempts to reach the human girl were blocked by unexpected complication that Victoria had not anticipated and had not prepared for when planning her revenge against the Cullens and against their protected human. The Quileute shapeshifters who lived on the reservation near Forks had apparently activated their defensive response to vampire presence in the area, the werewolves transforming and organizing patrols that protected their territory, and that extended protection to Bella Swan, who lived in Forks, but who had connections to the reservation through her friendship with Jacob Black, and through whatever arrangements the werewolves had made with the Cullens regarding Bella's safety. Victoria's first encounter with the wolf pack happened when she attempted to approach Bella's house and was intercepted by massive wolves whose speed rivaled vampire speed and whose numbers made them dangerous despite their youth and their relative inexperience as protectors. The shapeshifters were not the children of the moon that vampire lore described as immortal enemies, but were something different and something specific to the Quileute tribe, whose genetic heritage apparently included the ability to transform into giant wolves when vampires threatened their territory or threatened people they had chosen to protect. Understanding the werewolf problem required Victoria to observe their patterns and to learn their limitations, and to identify ways that she could evade them or could bypass them to reach Bella, despite their protection extending beyond their official reservation boundaries and into Forks proper, where Bella lived with her father. The wolves patrolled in packs and coordinated their movements with efficiency that suggested telepathic communication, or pack mind that allowed them to share information and to respond collectively to threats that individual wolves detected. Their speed was comparable to vampire speed, and their size was enormous, and their teeth and claws were capable of inflicting damage that could destroy vampire if they managed to catch one and managed to tear them apart before the vampire could escape. Their senses were acute enough to detect vampire scent from distance and to track vampire movements through their territory, making it difficult for Victoria to approach Bella's house without being detected and without facing multiple wolves, whose combined strength would make them dangerous opponents, even for vampire, whose gift was evasion. The ocean approach became Victoria's primary method for attempting to reach Bella during the months when the werewolves were protecting her, the water masking her scent and allowing her to swim along the coastline and to emerge on Fork's side of the territorial boundary without leaving scent trail that the wolves could follow inland from the reservation. The technique worked partially, but was not sufficient to actually reach Bella, because the wolves expanded their patrols, and because they learned to watch the coastline, and because they responded quickly enough that Victoria's window of opportunity was too small to allow her to reach Bella's house, and to kill her and to escape before the wolves arrived. The ongoing cat and mouse game between Victoria and the wolf pack continued through the fall and into the winter of 2005. Each attempt teaching Victoria more about their patterns, but also teaching the wolves more about her methods, and making subsequent attempts more difficult as both sides adapted to each other's strategies. The months of frustration accumulated as fall turned to winter, and winter turned towards spring of 2006. Victoria's repeated failures to reach Bella, intensifying her rage and intensifying her obsession and making revenge consume her existence completely, until nothing remained of the vampire she had been before James's death, except the survival instinct that kept her alive and the determination that kept her pursuing goal that was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. The isolation of her existence deepened as months passed without partnership and without companionship and without anything except the single-minded focus on killing Bella Swan. that had replaced all other purposes and all other interests. She hunted humans for survival, but the kills were joyless and were mechanical, the feeding being necessary to maintain her strength, but being devoid of the satisfaction that hunting with James had provided when kills had been shared experiences and had been meaningful beyond mere sustenance. The Cullens returned to Forks in January of 2006, represented closing of the window that Victoria had been attempting to exploit, Edward's presence restoring the full protection that Bella had enjoyed before his departure, and Alice's visions becoming active again in monitoring for Victoria's approach, and in warning the Cullens when Victoria made decisions that Alice's precognition could detect. The protection around Bella intensified as the Cullens apparently learned from Victoria's attempts during Edward's absence and implemented more comprehensive defenses that combined vampire monitoring with werewolf patrols and created multi-layered security that made reaching Bella seem nearly impossible without creating force capable of overwhelming the combined defenses. Victoria learned about events in Italy where Bella had apparently travelled and had apparently been brought before the Volturi who ruled vampire civilization and who enforced vampire law. The near-death experience apparently resulting from Bella's exposure to vampire world and from whatever circumstances had led to her appearing before vampire royalty, whose judgment could have resulted in her execution, but had instead resulted in her return to Forks alive and still human. The rage Victoria felt at Bella's continued survival, despite multiple opportunities for death, intensified her determination to be the one who killed her and to be the one who made Edward suffer loss comparable to what Victoria had suffered when James had been destroyed. The year of planning and the year of attempts and the year of failures had not diminished her obsession, but had strengthened it through frustration and through accumulated rage and through the emptiness that made revenge seem like the only purpose worth pursuing and the only goal worth achieving, regardless of cost or regardless of risk, to her own survival. The evolution of her strategy during these months moved from attempting to reach Bella personally to recognizing that solo approach would never succeed against the combined defenses that protected her, and that different method was required if Victoria was going to achieve revenge that had become her sole reason for continued existence. The idea of creating newborn army formed gradually as Victoria recognized that she lacked the individual strength or the individual abilities to overcome Cullen defenses, but that overwhelming force applied through multiple attackers might succeed where single vampire had failed repeatedly. Newborn vampires were powerful beyond normal vampire abilities during their first year of existence, the residual human blood in their systems enhancing their already formidable strength and making them nearly unstoppable in combat when their superior power was directed by vampire who controlled them and who directed their aggression towards specific targets. Creating newborn army was explicitly forbidden under Volturi law that prohibited transforming multiple humans in ways that would create vampire forces that could threaten vampire civilization or could threaten the secrecy that protected vampires from human awareness and human response. But Victoria's calculation was that revenge was worth the risk if she could succeed in killing Bella before the Volturi discovered the army and before they intervened to destroy it and to punish whoever had created it. The planning for the army's creation involved selecting location and selecting victims and developing strategy for controlling the newborns, whose bloodlust and whose aggression would make them difficult to manage but whose power would make them effective weapons if Victoria could direct them toward the Cullens and toward Bella. Seattle offered advantages as creation site, the large population providing ample victims for transformation, and the urban environment providing cover for the disappearances and deaths that would result from Victoria's activities as she built the force that would eventually attack Forks and would eventually overwhelm the defenses that had prevented her from reaching Bella through solo attempts. The risk of exposure through creating army in populated area was significant, but was acceptable compared to the alternative of continued failure and continued inability to achieve the revenge that had become Victoria's only remaining purpose in existence, that felt increasingly empty and increasingly meaningless without James, and without the partnership that had made immortality bearable. Seattle became Victoria's base of operations during the winter and spring of 2006, as she implemented the plan that would transform her from solitary avenger into creator of illegal newborn army, whose existence would violate Volturi law, and whose purpose would be overwhelming the Cullen defenses through sheer numbers and through the superior strength that characterized vampires during their first year of immortal existence. The city's population of approximately 600,000 people provided sufficient anonymity that Victoria could operate without immediate detection, and provided sufficient victim pool that she could transform multiple humans without exhausting available targets or without creating patterns so obvious that human authorities would immediately recognize supernatural involvement in the disappearances and deaths that would result from her activities. The urban environment offered advantages that rural areas could not provide. The baseline level of crime and violence and disappearance in large city, creating cover for Victoria's operations and creating explanation for mysterious deaths that would be attributed to human criminals, rather than being attributed to vampire creating army for revenge assault against another vampire coven. The first transformations happened in late winter of 2006, as Victoria began selecting victims according to criteria that would maximize the army's effectiveness while minimizing the difficulty of controlling the volatile newborns whose bloodlust would make them dangerous even to the vampire who created them. She chose young humans whose physical fitness and whose aggressive personalities suggested they would be effective fighters once transformed. The selection process involving observation of potential victims and evaluation of their characteristics and their likelihood of surviving transformation and of being useful in the attack that Victoria was planning. The transformation process itself was brutal and was impersonal. Victoria biting her selected victims and leaving them to complete the 3-day change without the comfort or the explanation that more responsible vampire creators might provide to their progeny. Her lack of concern for their suffering or their confusion being consistent with her view of them as weapons rather than as individuals whose transformation deserve care or whose immortal existence deserve consideration beyond their utility in achieving her revenge. Creating the newborns in small groups rather than transforming dozens simultaneously represented strategic decision based on Victoria's recognition that managing large numbers of volatile newborns would be impossible for single vampire whose abilities were defensive rather than offensive, and whose gift for survival would not help her. Control aggressive vampires whose newborn strength exceeded her own physical power. She transformed 3 or 4 humans at a time and waited for them to complete their change and emerge as newborns before transforming additional victims. The staggered creation allowing her to establish some level of control over earlier transformations before adding new members whose unpredictability and whose aggression would compound the management challenges. The chaos of multiple newborns in confined space was nearly unmanageable despite her cautious approach. The newly transformed vampires fighting each other for dominance and fighting over feeding opportunities and destroying each other with disturbing frequency that reduced Victoria's numbers and required her to create additional newborns to replace those lost to internal violence. Riley Beers became Victoria's solution to the control problem that threatened to make the entire army unmanageable and threatened to result in mutual destruction before the newborns could be deployed against the Cullens and against Bella. Riley was a 15-year-old boy whose disappearance in late March of 2006 was reported in local news as another missing person case in the series of disappearances that were beginning to attract attention from Seattle authorities and from media outlets that were starting to notice patterns in the vanishings. Victoria selected Riley deliberately from among the potential victims she had been observing. His age and his athletic build and his social position as popular student, making him ideal candidate for the role she needed him to fill as lieutenant, who would control the other newborns and would enforce her commands and would serve as intermediary between Victoria and the army whose direct management would be impossible for her to maintain, while also avoiding Cullen detection and while also planning the attack strategy. The transformation of Riley was performed personally by Victoria, rather than being executed through the quick bite and abandon method she used for the other newborns. Her investment in his transformation being greater because his role would be more important and because his loyalty would be essential to her control over the army. She stayed with him during his 3-day transformation and spoke to him during his moments of consciousness and created foundation for the emotional manipulation that would make him absolutely devoted to her and would make him believe that she loved him and would make him willing to do anything she commanded, because he believed they were partners and believed they were mates and believed that she cared for him as something more than tool to be used and discarded when his usefulness ended. The lies she told Riley during and after his transformation were calculated and were comprehensive. Her false narrative creating worldview where Victoria and Riley were central couple leading coven against external threats, rather than Victoria being solitary vampire using Riley as expendable lieutenant in revenge scheme that would likely result in his destruction. The emotional manipulation extended beyond simple deception about their relationship to include fabricated threat narrative that would motivate Riley and would motivate the other newborns to attack the Cullens with conviction, rather than attacking merely because Victoria commanded them to do so. She told Riley that the yellow-eyed vampires were hunting their coven and were threatening their existence and were planning to destroy them unless they struck first. The invented threat creating defensive justification for offensive action and creating motivation that would make the newborns fight desperately rather than fighting half-heartedly. She claimed that she and Riley were mates whose love was threatened by the Cullens' interference and whose future together depended on destroying the yellow-eyed vampires before they could destroy Victoria and Riley's relationship and their coven and their existence. Riley believed every word because newborn vampires lacked the experience and lacked the skepticism that would allow them to question their creator's narrative. His absolute faith in Victoria, making him perfect tool for controlling the other newborns and for directing their aggression toward the targets Victoria designated. Riley's role as lieutenant involved training the other newborns in combat techniques and enforcing discipline that prevented complete chaos and managing the feeding that kept the newborns satisfied enough that they did not constantly fight each other or did not attempt to leave the coven to hunt independently in ways that would expose the army's existence to authorities or to other vampires who might report the illegal activity to the Volturi. His intelligence and his natural leadership abilities made him effective in the role despite his youth and despite his recent transformation. The other newborns responding to his commands because he was stronger than most of them, through having been transformed earlier and because Victoria's obvious favor toward him established his authority and established consequences for disobeying him or for challenging his position as second in command of the growing army. Building the army throughout the spring of 2006 involved continuous transformation of new victims to replace newborns lost to internal fighting and to increase numbers toward the critical mass that Victoria calculated would be necessary to overwhelm 7 Cullen vampires plus whatever werewolf allies they might call upon during the battle. The transformations accelerated as spring progressed and as Victoria became more efficient in her selection and in her management of the creation process. Her experience with earlier batches teaching her which characteristics made humans more likely to survive transformation and more likely to be controllable afterward and more likely to be effective fighters when the army was finally deployed. The numbers grew from initial handful to dozen to 20 and eventually to more than 30 newborns whose combined strength represented overwhelming force that should theoretically be sufficient to destroy the Cullens and to reach Bella, despite whatever defenses the vegetarian coven had prepared. The Seattle mystery became national news story as human authorities noticed the pattern of disappearances and murders that characterized Victoria's activities during the months she spent building her army. The media coverage describing the Seattle killings as unprecedented crime wave and speculating about serial killer or about gang violence or about various human explanations that could not account for the actual supernatural cause of the deaths and disappearances. Victoria felt no concern about the exposure or about the attention that her activities were drawing from human authorities and from human media. Her focus on revenge making her indifferent to the risk of breaking the fundamental vampire law that required secrecy and required vampires to hide their existence from humans whose awareness of vampires would trigger organized response that would threaten vampire civilization. The calculation was that the army would be used and would be destroyed in single attack before the Volturi could respond to reports of newborn army in Seattle. The timeline being compressed enough that Victoria believed she could achieve her revenge before facing consequences for violating laws that she was aware of and was deliberately choosing to break. Training the newborns for combat involved teaching them to coordinate attacks and to overwhelm individual opponents through numbers, rather than relying on individual skill or individual strategy that newborns lacked the experience to employ effectively. Riley conducted the training sessions under Victoria's direction. his instructions focusing on basic tactics of surrounding targets and attacking simultaneously from multiple directions, and using superior newborn strength to tear apart opponents before they could mount effective defense. The training was crude, but was sufficient for army whose advantage was power and numbers, rather than being skill or sophistication. The newborns learning enough coordination that they could function as group, rather than as collection of individuals, whose attacks would be easily defeated by experienced vampires like the Cullens, who had decades or centuries of combat experience and tactical knowledge. The volatility of the newborn army created constant management challenges as newly transformed vampires fought each other over territory and over feeding opportunities and over perceived slights or challenges to their positions within the informal hierarchy that developed among them, despite Victoria's and Riley's attempts to maintain control and maintain focus on the external enemy, rather than on internal conflicts. Newborns died regularly through fights with each other, their destruction being waste of Victoria's effort in transforming them, but being acceptable loss as long as sufficient numbers survived to the deployment date, and as long as the remaining army was large enough to accomplish its purpose of overwhelming Cullen defenses. Victoria replaced losses through continuous new transformations, her activities in Seattle intensifying as spring progressed towards summer, and as the timeline for the attack approached, and as the need for sufficient numbers became more urgent. The deception strategy that kept Victoria herself hidden from the army except for Riley represented a crucial element of her survival plan. Her recognition that the Cullens would be seeking the army's creator and would be attempting to identify who was responsible for the illegal newborn transformations, making it essential that she remain unknown to the newborns, who might be captured, or might be questioned, or might reveal information that would allow the Cullens to find her. Riley served as a visible leader and as the face of authority that the newborns recognized, his position making him target for Cullen investigation and making him expendable shield that protected Victoria's identity and protected her ability to escape if the attack failed, or if circumstances required her to abandon the army before deployment. The newborns believed Riley was their leader and believed he had created them, the deception being maintained through Riley's own belief in the false narrative that Victoria had constructed where he was co-leader rather than being tool, and where Victoria was his mate rather than being manipulator using him for her purposes. The lies about the Cullens that Victoria taught to Riley, and that Riley then transmitted to the other newborns, created false motivation and created false narrative where the yellow-eyed vampires were aggressors threatening the Seattle Coven, rather than being defenders protecting human from Victoria's revenge attack. The newborns were told that the Cullens wanted to destroy them and wanted to eliminate their coven, and wanted to kill Riley and Victoria, whose leadership and whose existence threatened Cullen territorial claims or threatened Cullen interests in ways that the newborns never questioned, because they lacked context and lacked experience, and lacked reason to doubt the Creator who had given them immortal existence and who controlled their access to blood, and who represented the only authority they knew in their brief vampire lives. The enemy narrative made the newborns willing fighters whose aggression toward the Cullens was genuine rather than being forced. Their belief that they were defending themselves and defending their coven, making them more effective weapons than they would have been if they were simply following orders without understanding or without investment in the outcome. Bella's scent became a training tool that Victoria used to focus the newborns on their primary target. The clothing item she had stolen from Bella's house during one of her reconnaissance missions, providing scent sample that allowed the newborns to learn what they were hunting and to develop obsession with reaching the human whose smell triggered their predatory instincts and whose existence represented the ultimate goal beyond destroying the yellow-eyed vampires who protected her. The training with Bella's scent created fixation among the newborns, whose thirst and whose hunting instincts made them desperate to find the source of the scent and to feed on the human whose blood they could smell on the clothing but could not access because the clothing itself provided no satisfaction and no relief from the burning thirst that characterized newborn existence. The fixation served Victoria's purpose by ensuring that the newborns would pursue Bella aggressively once they were deployed and would not be easily distracted from the primary objective of killing her, even when facing opposition from the Cullens or from the werewolves who might join the defense. Managing the chaos of more than 30 newborns in Seattle required Victoria to maintain distance, while also maintaining control through Riley, whose authority over the army was established through his relationship with Victoria and through his earlier transformation that gave him strength advantage over newer newborns, and through his willingness to destroy newborns who challenged his commands or who threatened the cohesion of the group. The destruction of disobedient or problematic newborns was frequent enough that the survivors learned to follow Riley's instructions and learned to suppress their individual impulses in favor of group coordination that would be necessary during the attack. The discipline was crude and was enforced through violence rather than through respect or through genuine loyalty, but it was sufficient to create an army that could function as unit, rather than dissolving into complete chaos that would make deployment impossible. The timeline pressure intensified as spring turned towards summer, and as Victoria recognized that the Volturi would eventually notice the illegal army and would eventually send guard members to investigate and to destroy the newborns and to punish whoever had created them. The window for deploying the army was closing as each week passed, and as the Seattle killings continued to attract attention, and as the risk of Volturi intervention increased towards certainty that would arrive at some point in the near future. Victoria accelerated her preparations and finalized her attack plan. The strategy involving deploying the entire army against the Cullens in overwhelming assault that would occupy their defenses, while Victoria herself approached Bella from different directions and completed the revenge that had consumed her existence for 15 months since James's death in the Phoenix Ballet Studio. Alice Cullen's visions would show the army's approach and would show the attack coming. But Victoria calculated that the Cullens could not adequately prepare for force of 30-plus newborns whose combined strength would overwhelm 7 defenders, even if those defenders were experienced and were gifted and were coordinated in their response. The plan depended on the army creating sufficient chaos and creating sufficient threat that the Cullens would be forced to commit all their resources to stopping the newborn assault. The distraction providing Victoria with opportunity to slip past their defenses and to reach Bella and to kill her personally, rather than relying on the newborns to complete the task. Riley would lead the army's attack and would coordinate the assault and would likely die in the battle, his destruction being acceptable cost and being expected outcome that Victoria had planned for when designing strategy that treated him as expendable despite the false love she had professed and despite the partnership narrative she had constructed to secure his loyalty. Victoria's true plan involved never directly participating in the main battle that would occur when the army engaged the Cullens, her survival instinct making it impossible for her to commit to frontal assault that would expose her to destruction by experienced vampires whose combined abilities would make them dangerous even when outnumbered by a newborn army. She would remain hidden during the initial engagement and would approach Bella separately when the Cullens were occupied with defending against the main force, her evasion abilities and her strategic planning allowing her to bypass defenses and to reach the human girl and to complete revenge before escaping ahead of any pursuit or ahead of any Volturi response to the illegal army, whose existence would be discovered through the battle and through the aftermath. The escape plan involved disappearing immediately after killing Bella and vanishing into wilderness or into distant territory before the Cullens could organize pursuit or before the Volturi could arrive to investigate the newborn army and to punish its creator. May of 2006 brought the army to critical mass and brought Victoria's preparations to completion, the newborns numbering more than 30 and being trained sufficiently that they could coordinate basic assault tactics and being fixated sufficiently on Bella's scent that they would pursue her aggressively once deployed against Fawkes. Riley's absolute faith in Victoria and in the mission remained unshaken, despite the approaching battle and despite the obvious danger that the assault would create. His belief in their partnership and his belief in the threat narrative, making him willing to lead the attack and willing to risk destruction for the cause that Victoria had, convinced him was defending their coven rather than being revenge assault against vampires who had killed Victoria's actual mate 15 months earlier. The newborns were ready and the plan was finalized and the timeline was set. The attack approaching as Victoria's year of planning and obsession moved toward culmination that would either achieve her revenge or would result in her own destruction in the attempt to reach Bella Swan and to make Edward Cullen suffer loss equivalent to what Victoria had suffered when James had been killed. The alliance between the Cullens and the Quileute wolf pack represented complication that Victoria had not fully anticipated when planning her revenge assault, the traditional enemies apparently setting aside centuries of mutual hatred and territorial conflict to cooperate against the common threat that Victoria's newborn army represented to both their interests in protecting Bella Swan and protecting Fawkes from vampire invasion that would endanger humans under their respective care. The treaty that had kept vampires and shapeshifters separated and had prevented direct conflict between the Cullens and the wolves was suspended temporarily to allow joint training and joint defensive operations, the unprecedented cooperation creating combined force, whose coordination and whose complementary abilities would make them more effective defenders than either group could be independently. Victoria learned about the alliance through her continued reconnaissance of the area. Her observation of training sessions in the clearing north of Fawkes revealing that vampires and wolves were practicing combat techniques together and were learning each other's strengths and were developing coordinated tactics that would allow them to fight as unified force rather than as separate groups whose lack of coordination would create vulnerabilities that Victoria's army might exploit. Jasper Hale's expertise in newborn combat became crucial advantage for the Cullen Wolf Alliance. His experience in the Southern Vampire Wars during the 1860s, providing knowledge about newborn behavior and newborn tactics and newborn weaknesses that could be exploited by experienced fighters who understood how to counter superior newborn strength through strategy and through coordination. Jasper conducted training sessions for both the Cullens and the Wolves, his instruction covering techniques for fighting multiple opponents simultaneously, and for using newborn aggression against them, and for destroying newborns efficiently through targeting weaknesses that their lack of experience and their lack of control created. The wolves learned vampire combat methods, and the vampires learned to coordinate with wolf attacks, the joint training creating fighting force whose effectiveness would exceed what Victoria had calculated when planning assault, based on assumption that Cullens would fight alone, or would have only minimal werewolf support rather than having a fully integrated alliance with pack whose numbers and whose abilities would significantly increase defensive capabilities. The Cullens' preparation during May and early June of 2006 involved not only combat training, but also strategic planning about how to protect Bella during the battle that Alice's visions showed was approaching with increasing certainty as Victoria's decisions about timing and deployment became firmer and became visible in the precognitive visions that guided Cullen defensive preparations. The plan to hide Bella away from the main battle represented an attempt to remove her from immediate danger, while the Cullens and Wolves engaged the newborn army. Edward's role being to take Bella to the mountains, where she would be protected by distance and by Edward's presence, and by young werewolf Seth Clearwater, whose assignment was to assist Edward in guarding Bella if Victoria attempted to bypass the main battle and approach Bella directly. The strategy acknowledged that Victoria's true objective was killing Bella rather than destroying the Cullens. The defensive plan attempting to separate the target from the battlefield and to force Victoria to reveal herself if she wanted to reach Bella, rather than allowing her to approach during the chaos of the main engagement. Edward's mind-reading ability provided tactical advantage in planning defenses because his access to Alice's visions through reading her thoughts gave the Cullens complete picture of what Alice was seeing and what decisions Victoria was making and what the probable timeline for the attack would be based on the visions that were becoming clearer as Victoria's planning progressed toward finalization. The search for Victoria during the weeks before the battle involved attempts to locate her and to eliminate her before the army could be deployed. The Cullens, recognizing that destroying the Creator would likely cause the newborn army to dissolve into chaos or to disperse without the control that Victoria provided through Riley and through the structure she had imposed on the volatile group. But Victoria's evasion abilities and her strategic use of indecision to hide from Alice's visions made finding her impossible, despite Cullen efforts, her survival gift keeping her hidden and keeping her safe, while she finalized preparations for the assault that would deploy the army she had built during months of transformation and training in Seattle. The day of the battle arrived in mid-June of 2006, when Victoria finally committed to deploying her army, and when Alice's visions showed with certainty that the attack was imminent and that the newborns were moving from Seattle toward Forks in force that numbered more than 30 newly transformed vampires whose destination was the clearing where the Cullens were waiting with their wolf allies. Riley led the army as Victoria had planned, his position at the front of the force making him visible leader and making him primary target for Cullen response, while Victoria herself remained separate and remained hidden as she had always intended. The newborns moved with the single-minded aggression that characterized their nature, their fixation on Bella's scent driving them forward toward the clearing, where they expected to find their target and expected to find the yellow-eyed vampires whose destruction Riley had convinced them was necessary for their survival and for their coven's safety. Edward and Bella departed for the mountains before the army arrived, their absence from the main battle being intentional and being designed to remove Bella from immediate danger, while also creating a situation where Victoria would need to reveal herself if she wanted to reach her actual target. Seth Clearwater accompanied them in wolf form, the young werewolf's speed and his strength making him capable guardian despite his youth, and despite his relative inexperience compared to the older pack members who would fight in the main battle. The mountain campsite where Edward took Bella was remote and was defensible, the location selected to maximize distance from the battlefield, while also providing terrain advantages if Victoria managed to find them and managed to attack despite Edward's presence and despite Seth's protection. Victoria's approach to the mountain campsite happened simultaneously with the army's engagement in the clearing. Her timing calculated to coincide the main battle's beginning when the Cullens and wolves would be fully occupied and would be unable to assist Edward and Seth in defending Bella against Victoria's direct assault. Riley accompanied Victoria to the mountains despite being the designated leader of the army assault, his presence representing Victoria's insurance and representing additional attacker who would help her overcome Edward's defenses and would help her reach Bella. The decision to bring Riley violated the original plan, where he would lead the army and would likely die in the main battle. But Victoria's survival instinct apparently calculated that she needed assistance to overcome Edward and Seth, and that Riley's sacrifice in the mountains would be more useful than his sacrifice in the clearing, where his death would be one among many, rather than being directly contributing to achieving revenge against Bella. The fight at the mountain campsite began when Victoria and Riley emerged from the forest and confronted Edward and Seth, who were positioned defensively around the tent where Bella was sheltering from the cold and from the danger that Victoria represented. Edward's immediate recognition of Victoria's presence and Edward's defensive positioning made clear that he had been expecting her approach and had been prepared to defend Bella against the attack that Alice's visions had likely shown, despite Victoria's attempts to hide her intentions through maintaining indecision about exact timing and exact approach. Seth engaged Riley almost immediately, the young werewolf attacking the newborn vampire with ferocity that surprised Riley, whose underestimation of werewolf capabilities made him vulnerable to Seth's coordinated attacks and made him less effective fighter than his superior newborn strength should have allowed. Victoria faced Edward in combat that tested her evasion abilities against his speed and his strength and his centuries of experience, her defensive fighting style focusing on avoiding his attacks rather than on mounting offensive assault that would expose her to counterattacks she lacked the strength to survive. Edward's frustration at his inability to land decisive blow became apparent as Victoria used her gift to anticipate his movements and to evade his attacks with precision that made her almost impossible to catch. Despite his superior experience and despite his knowledge of fighting techniques that should have allowed him to overcome opponents whose abilities were purely defensive, the fight continued in stalemate pattern, where Edward could not catch Victoria, and Victoria could not get past Edward to reach Bella. The deadlock representing situation that Victoria had not fully planned for when designing her attack strategy. Riley's fight with Seth progressed less favorably for the newborn than Riley had apparently anticipated. The young werewolf's natural abilities and his pack training making him a formidable opponent despite his youth, and despite Riley's superior vampire strength that should have given him overwhelming advantage in direct combat. Seth's teeth and claws were capable of inflicting damage that could destroy Vampire if the wolf managed to land killing blows. His attacks, targeting Riley's vulnerable points and exploiting openings that Riley's newborn aggression created when rage overrode strategy and made him predictable in ways that experienced fighter would never be. The coordination between Seth's attacks and Edward's defensive positioning created situation where Riley was increasingly isolated and increasingly damaged despite his attempts to reach Bella or to assist Victoria in overcoming Edward's defense. The moment of Riley's death came when Seth managed to exploit opening in Riley's defenses and managed to land killing bite that severed Riley's head and destroyed the newborn whose loyalty to Victoria had been absolute and whose faith in their partnership had been unshaken even as he was dying in service to revenge that was not his and to cause that had been fabricated through Victoria's manipulation. Riley's final moments were characterized by continued belief in Victoria's love and continued belief in the mission they had supposedly shared. His dying thoughts apparently not including recognition that he had been tool rather than being partner, and that Victoria had used him for her purposes without genuine affection or genuine partnership. Victoria's response to Riley's destruction was minimal and was purely tactical. Her lack of emotional reaction to his death, revealing that he had indeed been expendable and that his relationship with her had been entirely one-sided despite the false partnership she had constructed through her manipulation and through her lies. Edward's psychological warfare during the fight involved speaking to Victoria about James and about the nature of James's feelings toward her. The verbal assault apparently designed to destabilize Victoria emotionally and to make her fighting less controlled and more predictable through rage that would override her survival instinct's guidance. Edward claimed that James had never loved Victoria and had viewed her as convenient partner rather than as mate. The assertions about James's true feelings being either truth that Edward had read in James's mind during their brief confrontation, or being lies designed to manipulate Victoria's emotions and to exploit vulnerability that love for James represented in her otherwise purely survival-focused psychology. Victoria's rage at Edward's words intensified her attacks and made her more aggressive in ways that contradicted her normal defensive style. The emotional response creating exactly the vulnerability that Edward had apparently been trying to create through his psychological assault. The turning point in Victoria's fight came when her increased aggression and her emotional state made her attacks more predictable and made her evasion less perfect. The rage overriding her survival instinct's calculations and creating opening that Edward could exploit through his superior speed and his superior combat experience. Edward seized the opportunity when Victoria's attack pattern created vulnerability, his hand catching her arm with grip that vampire strength made unbreakable, and that positioned her for destruction, that she could no longer evade despite her gift, and despite centuries of survival, through avoiding exactly this kind of situation. Seth coordinated with Edward in the final moments, the wolf and the vampire working together to destroy Victoria through combined assault that she could not escape and could not survive, despite her desperate attempts to use her gift to find way out of the trap that her own emotions had created. Victoria's final moments were characterized by fear that she had not experienced in centuries, her survival instinct screaming warnings that came too late to save her from the consequences of allowing rage to override caution and to override the defensive patterns that had kept her alive through hundreds of years of existence. Edward and Seth tore her apart with efficiency that came from their training and from their coordination. The destruction of her body being swift and being final, and being the end of the revenge quest that had consumed 15 months of her existence, and had ultimately resulted in her own death, rather than resulting in Bella's death, or in any satisfaction or in any completion of the purpose that had driven her since James's destruction. The burning of her remains ensured permanence, and ensured that Victoria's existence ended completely, and ended without possibility of recovery or continuation. The fire consuming all trace of the vampire whose survival gift had finally failed when it mattered most. The battle in the clearing concluded with complete destruction of Victoria's newborn army. Every vampire she had created being killed by the combined forces of the Kulans and the wolf pack, whose coordination and whose superior experience allowed them to systematically destroy the newborns despite the numerical advantage and despite the superior strength that the newly transformed vampires possessed. The sole exception was Bree Tanner, young newborn who surrendered during the battle and who was spared temporarily by the Cullens, who recognized her innocence and recognized that she had been manipulated by Victoria rather than being willing participant in the assault. But Bree's surrender and the Cullens' mercy became irrelevant when the Volturi arrived to investigate the illegal newborn army. Jane and Felix and Dimitri and Alec, appearing after the battle had concluded, and after the evidence of Victoria's violations of vampire law was apparent through the burning remains and through the testimony of the surviving participants. The Volturi's execution of Bree, despite her surrender and despite her innocence, demonstrated the absolute nature of vampire law, and demonstrated that the Volturi's enforcement included no mercy and included no consideration of circumstances or of manipulation when violations occurred. Jane killed Bree through her pain infliction gift, while Felix destroyed the young newborn's body, the casual brutality of the execution serving as a reminder to the Cullens and to the witnesses that creating newborn armies was forbidden absolutely, and that even innocent participants would be destroyed to enforce the law and to prevent any possibility of the practice continuing or spreading. The Cullens explained to the Volturi that Victoria had created the army and that Victoria had been destroyed during the battle, the information satisfying the Volturi's need to identify the lawbreaker and to confirm that appropriate punishment had been administered even if the punishment had come from the Cullens rather than from the Volturi Guard members themselves. The investigation concluded with Volturi acceptance that the threat had been eliminated and that the illegal army had been destroyed, and that no further action was necessary beyond warning the Cullens about the danger of situations that attracted newborn armies, or that created circumstances where vampire law might be violated even unintentionally. The departure of the Volturi representatives marked the end of the crisis and marked the confirmation that Victoria's plan had failed completely and had resulted in destruction of everyone she had involved in her revenge scheme, including herself and including Riley, and including all 30-plus newborns whose brief vampire existences had been consumed by purpose that was not theirs, and by vendetta that they had not chosen, and by manipulation that had used them as weapons in conflict they had not understood. Bella's survival represented Victoria's ultimate failure. The human girl whose existence had triggered James's fatal hunt, and whose protection had motivated the Cullens to destroy James, remaining alive and remaining safe despite 15 months of Victoria's planning, and despite the newborn army, and despite Victoria's personal assault in the mountains. Edward's protection had been successful, and the combined defenses had been sufficient, and Victoria's obsession had consumed her without achieving the revenge that had been her sole purpose since James's death in March of 2005. The cost of Victoria's failure included her own destruction, and included Riley's death, and included the destruction of every newborn she had created. The casualties being entirely on Victoria's side, while the Cullens and their allies survived intact and victorious. The legacy Victoria left behind included the Seattle mystery that would never be officially solved despite human investigations. The killing spree ending abruptly in June without explanation that human authorities could understand or could accept. Riley Beers's family never learned what happened to their son, whose disappearance remained unsolved mystery that would haunt them indefinitely. The parents never knowing that he had been transformed into vampire and had been manipulated into loving his killer, and had died believing lies that Victoria had constructed to secure his loyalty. The newborns' former lives included families and friends who would never have closure about disappearances and about deaths. The victims of Victoria's revenge scheme extending beyond those she had directly destroyed to include all the humans whose loved ones had vanished into her army and had died in her failed assault. The Cullen Werewolf alliance that had formed to fight Victoria's army represented lasting change in the relationship between the traditional enemies. The cooperation during the battle creating foundation for continued coordination and creating mutual respect that had not existed before the shared defense of Bella and shared victory over the newborn threat. Bella's memory of the year under Victoria's threat would include fear and would include awareness that she had been hunted, and that only the constant protection of the Cullens and the wolves had kept her alive when Victoria's determination and Victoria's resources had been focused entirely on killing her. James remained unavenged despite Victoria's 15 months of effort, his death in Phoenix standing as unpunished crime that Victoria had died attempting to address and had died failing to remedy through revenge that had consumed her existence and had ultimately consumed her life. So rest now, Twilight Souls, with Victoria's journey complete from unknown human origins through centuries of solitary survival to partnership with James that gave her existence meaning, before that meaning was destroyed in Phoenix Ballet Studio, and before obsession consumed the survivor, and before revenge destroyed what nothing else could kill across hundreds of years of immortal existence. Her story carries the weight of survival instinct that kept her alive for centuries, becoming the very thing that failed her. When rage overrode caution, and when love for James demanded vengeance, that her gift should have warned her was impossible to achieve without sacrificing the survival that had been her defining characteristic and her greatest ability. The predator who evaded every danger finally fell to the trap that her own emotions created, the evasion failing and the survival ending in mountains, where Edward and Seth destroyed what centuries of threats could never touch. Even immortals meet their end, when obsession replaces instinct, when revenge consumes purpose, when the survivor forgets that staying alive matters more than settling scores that cannot bring back what was lost. Sleep knowing that some pursuits destroy the pursuer, that survival sometimes means letting go, that even the wildest predator eventually falls,